So, hey guys, today we're going to be talking about specifically how unbalanced going first is in Yu-Gi-Oh! And yes, genuinely just really dumb. No other way to really put it. So, let's look at it this way. What is the most disgusting thing you can do going first? Or what is the strongest thing you can do going first? Well, that is, of course, ending the game on the spot, so there is no turn two. So that would mean simply like an FTK, so we'll just put in Gimmick Puppet to represent that. Uh, sure. We'll do this, right? So how do we counter this problem? So if going first, we just remove all hand traps, all right, then how do we deal with FTKs, which they're not a small number of FTKs, we'll put it that way. Well, I guess we'll need hand traps, so that'll be like Ash Blossom, Visciols, whatever, right? And that'll stop the FTKs, so the power level for things, it's kind of dumb, to the point where I think it wouldn't necessarily be optimal to do it right now because, you know, hand traps exist, but how many decks do you guys think unironically can do an FTK even if it's like really inefficient? If your opponent can't respond, I mean, it becomes a lot more viable, but how many decks can randomly just FTK? Because I'm pretty sure Super Heavy Samurai and Snake Eyes can FTK, just saying, you know, and it's probably as even like a one card combo, so that's great, I guess. And honestly, at this point, it doesn't really matter what deck you're playing to an extent if we just become kind of FTK central or FTK centric. Because, well, why do you care what your opponent's playing? Because you won the coin flip, you win the game because you're going first, you FTK, right? But we do have hand traps, so we have to take that into account. That clearly, that's part of the reason why I guess you end up loading up on so many hand traps, right? You don't want to be FTK'd. That's a small part of it. So that's one reason why, in general, board breakers can be kind of trash, just conceptually, if we're just considering mostly just going first and going second. If there's no turn two, Raigeki is completely a meaningless card because you just can't activate it at all during the entirety of the game. But this complicates things a little bit. So now, wait, if we're running all of these hand traps, how do we play the game? Because, you know, if I have like too many hand traps, oh, cool, I have no play. I just have hand traps and I can't do anything. And then my opponent can't do anything, but I also can't do anything. I'm just throwing hand traps at my opponent and they can't play the game. I can't play the game. And it's just kind of a painful time. So now that's why we have more powerful engine in general. So if we look at, for example, like, I mean, Vanquish Soul's not like the best example, but I mean, it does have some qualities that make it kind of good for this. So if we normal summon Rosin gets ashed. Okay, I'll just link off the Rosin for rock and then add it to hand and then special summon it again next turn to add, and then I can still maybe do the pop effect. Just maybe, you know, that's fine. If you try to imperm the Rosin, I can potentially use Caesar Valius to return Rosin to the hand, and that'll be fine, I guess. Now that I think about it, could you imperm Xiaolong, like, before Rock gets activated to return Rosin to the hand to play around Caesar Valius to prevent Xiaolong from searching Snow Devil, most likely? Never thought about that, but I guess you could do that. Huh. Whack. But anyways, continuing on. Now we have like cards that end up playing around hand traps some more, and also these engines are more efficient, but not necessarily able to set up FTKs. So, for example, Vanquish Soul, the only time you could have FTK'd with Vanquish Soul was specifically, I mean, it wasn't even a legit FTK because you kill on turn 2, but on for the low life point events, you would be able to burn with Vanquish Soul for game, I guess. And honestly, I don't think it was that efficient, but you know, it could get the job done, right? Because Borger burns for 1,500, and then we also have Snow Devil to burn. So gets the job done, I guess. So that's kind of how that goes, I suppose. But most of the interaction here is going to be, well, interaction to stop your opponent from doing whatever it is they're trying to do, and that's what we're mostly playing in terms of going first decks as of currently, I suppose. But these decks right now essentially just set up for turn 3 OTK. That's mostly how they're built. And is this necessarily the most efficient strategy? Like, depending on the card pool, I don't know, genuinely, because I haven't calced it out. And the card pool is just so ginormous. If there's actually, for example, a really broken FTK, then that kind of turns the game on its head, and it becomes like pretty unplayable, I guess. So imagine every time you go second, there's an extremely strong FTK that you can't do anything about, and you'll end up losing to it. And then if you end up going first, you still can't play because maybe it's like that efficient, and it can also go second somehow, some way. They have some option. So whatever deck this would be, it would be the only deck people would end up playing, and then it just evolves into non-games, essentially. But with cards like, I guess, Rosin, at least, you're destroying your opponent's cards and stuff, instead of, just ending the game on the spot. Because activating, for example, the Gimmick Puppet field spell, it kind of does just somewhat end the game on the spot, depending on like what hand traps your opponent may or may not have. So that's absolutely going to be brutal. And then that's probably it for, I guess, mostly monster-based strategies. Just I guess we'll put in Vanquish Soul to kind of represent some combo, but there's also like differing degrees to combos, because there are combos that you can do that just prevent your opponent from playing the game at all, which is still like pretty much the same as an FTK almost, except they can technically kind of play. So for example, maybe you prevent your opponent from being able to activate spells or traps, and also they're not allowed to special summon monsters, and also you have several Omni negates for whatever reason. But then your opponent does like normal summon sphere mode, and then they just special summon a bunch of guys and start activating cards and setting up OTK or whatever, right? I mean, technically there's also like that kind of category of board. But yeah, for the most part, it's just going to be mostly just regular combo, like, I don't know, Yubel, Snake Eye, whatever. Although Snake Eye, I guess, can technically be an FTK deck. Well, whatever the case. Yeah, so we have Vanquish Soul here, and then we have Gimmick Puppet. What else do we have? So we have now some purple card decks, so control decks basically. So I guess we'll grab Labyrinth here. So these decks are also kind of problematic, but like in a different kind of way than these ones. So going first, control decks are just super oppressive, because in general that there is not as much counterplay. So it's not necessarily going to be Labyrinth being the best example of this, because Labyrinth is actually somewhat susceptible to hand traps. But if we were to look at, for example, I don't know, let's say maybe a Paleo build instead, we're going to have like Oleanoids, Canadia, we have Dynamiscus, we have these kinds of cards, and we have Daruma Karma Cannon. And the thing about all of these cards is that they're essentially the same type of thing as like Rosin. Like, you have interaction, but there's no like interaction you can do with the back row with hand traps. So it kind of ends up playing around that, which is pretty strong in its own way. Then it has its own weakness of back row removal, like Duster. So Duster immediately removes all of the removal your opponent might have in the back row, which ends up kind of leaving your opponent with actually no play, because they have no back row anymore, which is basically what their whole deck was kind of about. which is kind of disgusting. And there are other cards kind of in the category of Duster, so we'll just have Duster representing them for the time being. So you drop Duster, you won't be able to activate these effects. And technically, you start the game with 5 cards, and even without drawing, you have 5 spell and trap zones. So if we were to set like 5 relatively good back row cards, so we'll go with, I don't know, let's say Torrential, Canadia, Dynamiscus with Destructive Dharma Karma Cannon. But I guess technically we won't be able to activate Dynamiscus specifically here. So we'll just replace and make this even more disgusting and go like double Karma Cannon Dynamiscus. So we might, in this case, hold on to Torrential Tribute in our hand, potentially. Or maybe we just don't care and we can hold on to the Dynamiscus for longer, but whatever. Here we're looking at destroy all monsters on field twice, and then Book of Moon every single monster on the field twice, or Book of Eclipse twice, because there's no hard ones return on any of these cards. And then Dynamiscus, I mean, if we did have draw power on the first turn, we would have Dynamiscus to banish a card as well. And that is how many interactions? Like 5 board wipes, almost, it feels like. Well, not 5, it's like closer to 4 board wipes is how it feels. Well, I guess Daruma isn't actually a board wipe, but it feels close to it. So yeah, pretty disgusted. And there are cards that are just more efficient technically than, well, Torrential, just situationally. Like a card that could be really efficient would be like Ice Dragon Prison. So for example, let's say our opponent is playing, we'll go with Yubel. So if I have Ice Dragon's Prison here, and my opponent activates, let's say, this effect here. Let's see, where is it? Grave Squirmer effect to special summon, let's say, a Spirit of Yubel, and they also have a Phantom of Yubel on the field, so I'm going to be able to then special summon the Spirit of Yubel that they targeted with Grave Squirmer, so they're down the Grave Squirmer, and then I'll banish the Phantom, so they're also down now the Spirit, the Phantom, and also the Gruesome Grave Squirmer. So that's 3 cards for 1 card. And all I had to do was just set this from my hand, which is kind of disgusting. So now, the reason why this card would simultaneously be bad is because if I'm actually going second then, well, then Ice Dragon's Prison, it wouldn't be able to do that play that we mentioned earlier, because our opponent would have already did the thing, so they wouldn't have to do it again, and they would have probably lethal, so they can just swing per game, just attack. And then also the earliest time you can activate this is going to be turn 3, which is quite late. So for example, like in this case, then Torrential Tribute, okay, you can destroy all monsters on the field when a monster is summoned, right? But your opponent doesn't necessarily have to summon a monster anymore, because they just don't need to, because they probably already have lethal, and they can just attack for game and don't need to necessarily do anything. So incredibly awkward. And yeah, that also, of course, doesn't account for the fact that they could still have like Harpy's Feather Duster and stuff. So just a whole lot of, yeah, you're not doing too well against that. You're feeling a little sick, perhaps even. But then, there's going to be one other, I guess, category to this kind of deck. We have kind of like stun decks where we run stuff like Skill Drain, Fossil, Dyna, Inspector Border, all of this stuff. It also plays around hand traps. So if we just essentially, if we were to put this onto a flowchart, it would be like FDKs end up going second decks, but combo decks here run a lot of hand traps now. That's kind of how they function, I suppose. So they kind of counter the FTK decks, because the FTK decks just can't really do their thing. And then we have control decks, which can kind of if they end up going first, counter the going first decks in this case, because they also want to go first and do their thing to prevent you from playing the game. But yeah, honestly, if we just boil down to it, the game mostly evolves into like going first player does not want going second player to play, and they'll do whatever they can, right? So maybe they'll make sure there's no turn 2. Maybe they'll just do something on turn 1 to stop you from playing turn 2. That kind of sums it up pretty well here. No matter like how we're looking at it, that's kind of what we're looking to do, and that's kind of objective with this, which makes it kind of complicated, because if we're trying to build really efficient decks, they're going to be pretty, well, yeah, they're going to end up being pretty degenerate in like certain senses, right? And this is really rough for the going second player, because not only do you have to technically go first in this game, you still have to go second, which is where it complicates the game a little bit more. So in Master Duel, you won't necessarily have to play against the same guy twice, so it's not best of 3. But I've kind of had a pseudo best of 3 where I opened the exact same hand and my opponent opened also the exact same hand. So we just played the exact same game, but twice. But the second time, my opponent scooped because we already played the game out before and they opened the same hand. So nothing actually changed, which is kind of hilarious from the matchmaking. But yeah, anyways. If we were to go second, then a lot of these strategies become a lot worse, because going first is just more powerful in general. So a lot of people will prefer playing for going first anyways. If you play for going second, I mean, worst case scenario, you just get FTK'd, right? Because none of your cards might be able to do anything. So for example, you'd play Sphere Mode, Lava Golem, which are insanely good board breakers, right? And we're going to assume that they will be activatable, but I mean, you won't be able to summon or activate anything, right? If you get FTK'd, but even if you don't get FTK'd, there might be good enough recovery in plays that you can't end your opponent, and you just end up in a losing position anyways. And I mean, most of things essentially are just much more efficient going first than they are going second to begin with. So if we look at Rosin, for example, Rosin, if we are going first, this is what Rosin looks like, right? We normal summon Rosin, we add a guy, and then we can pass on this, and then Rosin can do a pop, right? But if we have the same amount of cards, then we won't be able to even do the Rosin pop, because we actually need maybe one additional card for Rosin. So just Rosin as a 1 card going second versus going first, that's the difference, right? We can't even pop with Rosin, it just searches a guy and it becomes like a 1.8k, might as well be a vanilla monster, honestly. 1.8k vanilla monster. And then of course the FTK deck, well, now that your opponent has like an established board of some sort, you're not going to be FTKing for the most part. And it's just kind of over for you, because you didn't get to go first, didn't get to perform your FTK. So Gimmick Puppet actually can kind of play going second. It's not like absolutely horrendous, but assuming you were playing, for example, like one of the old FTKs where maybe you go like Hulk or Roydon, okay, I drop a monster negate on Hulk, damn. Or I destroy first round Hulky 5-Rex, damn. GG, I have no more plays, because I have to do this exact FTK line, and my whole deck is just devoted to it. And yeah, nothing else I can do if you pop Hulk. Literally nothing in my deck does anything anymore. So FTK dead, essentially. Trap cards here. They mostly want to set up, stop your setup, I would say. So yeah, if you've already set up, they're just much worse. So yeah, that's not great. And I mean, the floodgates, well, they're not as bad now, I guess, because there's much less of them. But some of the floodgates were actually board breakers as well. So something like a skill drain or a rivalry can be used as a board breaker. So for example, we can chain 1 torrential tribute. Then if my opponent chain 2's like Baron DeFleur, I can chain 3 skill drain, and that'll negate the Baron and get off my like torrential tribute. Or I can use like rivalry or Gozen or Peekaboo or whatever, and that will force my opponent to send the majority of their monsters for the most part. and then they're in a losing position because usually if you're running these floodgates, you can play under them somehow, some way, some shape or form. But I mean, floodgates still much worse if your opponent's set up first. So for example, let's say I have a Baron to floor, and then my opponent flips some floodgates. I still have like a 3k guy, right? But if my opponent went first, I can't summon the Baron under these floodgates, so I end up with something like maybe a Razin, you know? In terms of stat line, and my opponent has something bigger, and I'll just gradually lose, or it pretty much will just be a loss because I have no options to deal with like skill drain necessarily. So yeah, that's kind of the nature of going first, and kind of how all of these different types of decks kind of interact with one another. And I gotta say, it's all relatively rough because, you know, since you want to win the game, technically you want to make the strongest thing you technically could, but the strongest thing it kind of devolves into something that's kind of closer to this. Yeah, well, it kind of prevents your opponent from playing because you just have so many interactions. So if we're looking at like a 10 interaction board, I only have like 6 cards in my hand, maybe 6 or 5, depending on exactly what I did. So yeah, that's pretty rough. I mean, the worst case scenarios, I think, right now are it's all mostly back row related, and also the stun cards, the floodgates, like these guys, they're all pretty bad. In terms of, well, floodgates, control decks can also run them at the same time and run their own thing, so that's a thing, I guess. And then after that, you have to consider that you're running like Fossil Dyna, Skill Drain, Inspector Border, Tikaboo, Rivalry, whatever, Moonmirror Shield, all of that annoying crap. Yeah, that's not like super easy to deal with, but it's like super bad going second. It's just pretty toxic. It's not even necessarily optimal because you do have to consider going second, right? But it devolves into non-game. So if you set up your floodgates, I might have potentially like the out to your floodgates, like a Duster or Evenly might be able to completely cook you, right? But if I don't have it, then I just pretty much lose. So that's kind of sucky. And even if no floodgates, if I just have the backer removal for your backer deck, oh, I guess it's kind of GG. Good game. Which kind of sucks. So that's the thing that sucks with most of these purple cards. It's just kind of like comparing hands. That's kind of how they feel right now, in my opinion, which I don't really like too much. Because, you know, like an effect like Daruma Arma Cannon or Ice Dragon's Prison can be like game warping or game ending after card resolves, right? And it's just impossible to come back from because it just can build up so much advantage or like take so many of your opponent's resources. So in the case of like if we were playing against Yubel, that's like 3 card swing for 1 card, which is absurd, right? So if we were to like put those 3 cards in hand, that would be like 2 cards left. And my opponent still has potentially 4 more, right? So that's pretty disgusting in the other direction as well. So yeah, pretty awful in general. And look at this, it kind of makes me wonder why I'm playing the game to an extent, but yeah, I know why I'm playing the game. But yeah, after that we have FTKs, which are kind of degenerate, and it's just kind of like a really big dumb flowchart. But you know, draft decks also lose the FTK because they just don't do anything necessarily. You won't be running like that many hand traps in this, so yeah. Certain decks have like inherent advantages over other decks, and well, yeah, these advantages and disadvantages, do they make or break the game? I don't really think so necessarily, but I'm glad that most people prefer playing combo at least, because playing against like floodgate decks is not necessarily fun. Like honestly, to an extent, somewhere deep down, I'm pretty sure I know that some floodgate build is probably the most efficient. Like, it's not necessarily going to be like hard floodgates. You can run a few floodgates and they can be pretty disgusting. Like maybe 4 of them, and if you get hit by certain like hand traps, you can just set them, flip them over, and then you probably still win the game anyways. So yeah, that's all I got for you guys today. And I mean, hopefully the game gets a little bit more interesting than this, because FTK decks are kind of just, to an extent, a sin, but they're kind of part of the game as well. And then all of these things are also part of the game, I suppose, to an extent. So yeah, but the thing I hate the most is probably just straight up the floodgates. The floodgates are like terrible, especially when they're so easily accessible. So like just normal summon a guy and you can't special summon at all is pretty ridiculous. So yeah, that's all I got for you guys today, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye.